Breaking down the have-not offenses, and is there a way out for them, for their fantasy players, how to play it in fantasy? That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas and Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work at RotoViz. And Shawn, we hit record here an hour after we tend to jump on with each other, because a lot of times we like to chat a little bit before. We just did about an hour talking about a lot of what we've seen around the NFL, and a lot of it has not been good so far. It's kind of funny. We always joke we probably should have just got that recorded. I know a lot of our listeners who enjoy the show are like, we would have liked to have heard that conversation as well. We'll try to get a lot of that into the show. But the big story when we jump on and we start talking to each other is just there are a lot of offenses that are not succeeding right now for a variety of reasons. And I've been writing about it a lot in Stealing Signals. I know you've been thinking about it, talking about it, writing about it. You had a great note on the Panthers on the Sunday recap show over on RotoViz Overtime. And that was your thought for our show topic for today as well. So you had some notes and we just jumped right into it. But we're going to go through a lot of these teams. You've pulled up a lot of data here from the RotoViz tools, including stuff like points per drive, play volume, a lot of interesting thoughts on these offenses. But the big high-level headline around the league is there's just a lot of bad offenses right now in the NFL.
There are, and it sort of goes across so many different areas as well, where we sit through that Sunday night football game that seemed like it could be so exciting because you had Jimmy Garoppolo, not a superstar, but someone who's played fairly well until the very end of the Super Bowl. Someone who, when he's played for the 49ers under Kyle Shanahan, the 49ers have been fantastic. You have Russell Wilson, who obviously has been one of the shining stars of the NFL over the last decade. Both of those players are surrounded by elite talent. I mean, these aren't quarterbacks who don't have options. You've got some of the best groups of skill set players in the entire NFL on these two teams. And yet, I mean, when you finish 11-10, you don't need to tell people, okay, this is one of the worst games we've ever seen. The accuracy on some of these passes where the receivers had their guys beat was, pretty mind-boggling and not in the right direction. We have a lot of teams that are in much worse shape when we think about the direction that we're going forward. It was a lot of fun to play with the RotoViz tools to kind of put together our sheet here. We've got the team splits app, which makes it really easy to pull up things like points per drive for the teams. Right now, we have so many teams that are at 1.6 or below. Those are terrible numbers. Now, it's much easier to put up that kind of a number over just 3 games as opposed to a whole season. These teams that are bad, I mean, they're mostly going to regress in a positive direction, but that's not the scoring level that you're wanting to see. It's fun to go in and look at the NFL pace tool, see things like seconds to snap, pass, run, breakdown. You can look at it in a lot of different game script context. You can look at run and pass plays per 60 minutes. You can look at it for offense. You can look at it for defense. Have the advanced stat explorer, the Stealing Signals tool, all of these kinds of things. And then so many of you listeners have already read Ben's Stealing Signals. So you've got a great sense of how all of these teams played. Colin was pulling out his favorite quote from Stealing Signals for our OT show yesterday. Not surprisingly, that was talking about DJ Moore retiring. The Carolina Panthers,
which was a joke. in case you don't have all the context. It just feels like he probably should consider that at this point.
Just go out on a high before things get even worse than a...
Yeah, I mean, I wrote it. He probably should. He's probably thinking about retiring, and I wouldn't blame him. Which, what are you going to do?
When you've got a 39% catch rate, a 9.5 target depth, when you're losing the target battle to the combination of Robbie Anderson and Shi Smith, it's like, just go out before it gets even worse.
Yeah. But yeah, your point, I mean, the points per drive stuff, we can talk about just total scoring. And right now, the average NFL team is averaging 21 points per game. Last year, it was 23. Back in 2020, really high scoring season, 24.8. You go back the previous several seasons, it's typically right around 23. maybe in the 22s, 22.8, 22.6. We're way down at 21. And it feels like we've had more sort of, fluky touchdowns so far this year. We've had some punt block returns for TDs. I immediately think of the pick 6 in the Kansas City Chargers game last Thursday. There's been, I don't have all those numbers pulled up, but I think there's been a decent number of defensive and special teams touchdowns or turnovers. I know there's been a couple strip sack touchdowns. The Patriots had one against the Dolphins in week 1 where Mac Jones got stripped and gave up a TD. I know there's been more than that. This is not, scoring is down, and it's down not because there's not been, these ancillary sort of fluky touchdowns. Those have been there. It's been down because the offenses are not scoring.
You have a Laviska Shenault touchdown where it really looked like the defense was doing some kind of comedy routine. It was like a bowling pins type of skit where Laviska catches it, and then suddenly 11 guys drop to the ground.
No, that had nothing to do with the defense. That had everything to do with Laviska Shenault being a clear hit as a prospect. We saw it there on that play. The skill set is all there.
You know that the world is great when, I'm watching the games on Sunday and I'm trying to emotionally deal with DeAndre Swift being injured, but that play happens, and I just it's kind of like having a song stuck in your head, right? Where the entire rest of the day, the only thing I was just thinking to myself in my head was, roll the clip, roll the clip, roll the clip.
But the worst part about it was the immediate realization that play, with the way the Saints were playing, was going to win the Panthers the game. And all I want for Christmas is Matt Rule to get fired, and that win because of a Carolina Panthers defensive touchdown on an Alvin Kamara fumble early, which is just a total fluke play, 44 years. And not just a fumble, but the recovery is always, talked about in football analytics circles as being a complete coin flip where the ball bounces and who gets it. But the fact that it bounces from sort of the middle of the mass of bodies on a run play where, it's kind of bottled up in the backfield. There's a lot of players around. It bounces right to a player who gets free and goes for a touchdown. Perfect for the Panthers, but they got that one score and had nothing else all game, and yet the Saints could get nothing going. It was 13-7 at that point in the fourth quarter, and Laviska has this fantastic play that I was super excited about, but I immediately was like, great, now Matt Rule's going to win a game. I was really hoping he'd start 0-5, 0-6, get the axe.
So the Panthers are averaging 1.6 points per drive, almost a surprising number there, but it does, again, rest on some fluky things like the Laviska score. We have DJ Moore more or less not involved. When we were talking earlier, you mentioned that the scheme isn't helping, the play calling isn't helping. We don't have a lot of these elements that you get from teams like the Rams, teams like the Chiefs, and all of the coaching staffs that are sort of off of the trees of those different teams. And yet, they give him a couple of handoffs here. It's not just that. He was wide open on a number of occasions. And as a good teammate, you try and control your frustration to an extent. But, this was almost like, and it's a very different kind of overall environment because the Minnesota Vikings, despite the things that they struggle with, are 2-1 and have done some much better things. But it's the extreme version of Justin Jefferson's frustration every time that Kirk Cousins has him wide open and throws the ball in some other zip code. At some point, it's just very difficult to handle as a player like DJ Moore. But it's not just him. And this offense is tragic in really every way. Christian McCaffrey ranks number 12 at the running back position with 6.7 receiving expected points per game. He's underperforming that by 2 because not only are they not using him, but the quality of the targets that they're putting together is very low. We talked about McCaffrey as being someone that you had to consider at the 101 because even within this Panthers offense, when he's been healthy the last couple of years, the overall profile is still such that you can't get that from any other player in football, perhaps with the exception of Cooper Kupp in a different position. And so you have positional concerns there or considerations. But we're 3 games in, and I really already feel like it's pretty conclusive that, you're not going to get that profile this year. His expected points from 2019 to 2021 were at 22.6. He's down at 16.7 this year. He could, there's going to be some move probably in the right direction, but it's not like he's not on the field or he's not touching the ball. Christian McCaffrey led the entire NFL in percentage of teams' touches or team opportunity share this past week. They can't get him more involved. They would have to make better decisions. And there's nothing that we have seen that would indicate, number one, that they'll have a lot of goal line touches, or number two, that they'll make better decisions overall.
Well, and what's so frustrating, okay, there's several things, but McCaffrey's still playing well. He's running effectively and efficiently. He had a long run called back in this game, but he still ran for over 100 yards on his 25 carries, which were all pretty much, ram him into the line on obvious running downs on 1st and 10. The type of stuff that doesn't really work. Last week, he had a 100-yard game on 15 carries. He's averaging 4.9 yards per carry, which is really good for any running back because Christian McCaffrey's good. That's sort of maddening to me, though, because, back after week 1, we talked a little bit about a team that we really like that you and I have that started McCaffrey, A.J. Brown, Tyreek Hill, and had Jalen Hurts, and we're saying this team is going to be unstoppable if McCaffrey is McCaffrey. This is our best team. And I told you that I still had some reason for optimism with McCaffrey. And you were like, that's good because I'm concerned. I don't have that optimism anymore. I'm as concerned as you. In week 1, he only had 10 carries. He had 4 receptions. He also got a goal line carry. His rate of sort of the high value touches, I'm always talking about the receptions and the goal line work, as a percentage of his total touches was still high. And the Panthers just ran very few plays in that week 1 game. I felt like you scale this up, he's going to catch 6-8 balls a game. And we've seen the opposite. As they've scaled up and had some normal play volume games, they've just added more low-value rush attempts to his workload. This past week, 25 carries, only the 2 receptions. And to your point, it's not just the lack of volume, it's the type of receptions. I don't think I've seen him run that option route that we talk about so much that he's so good at, where he comes out of the backfield. He's basically a slot receiver. They get him one-on-one with the linebacker. He can go in or out. And they showed it even last year under Matt Rule, which is so confusing. But it's like whatever way he breaks, he's going to win and have so much separation that the quarterback can just get him the ball a couple of yards beyond the line of scrimmage with room to run. It's like a free 5 or 7 yards.
They've removed the best play in their offense.
That's the best play in their offense. It's an easy 5-7 yard gain every time.
And it's a way to get Christian McCaffrey the ball that, number one, has a much higher expected value, both from a reality perspective and a fantasy perspective. And it's a play where, maybe he takes a little bit more of an awkward hit out there in space, but the overall beating that you get when you're pounding him into the line 20, 25 times, contrast that with what he's doing when he's out there and he's beating the linebacker on one of these pass routes.
Right. And you're trying to keep this guy healthy. He's had injury issues the last couple of years. There's no justification for this. And this is why, one of the things we talked about before the show in our hour was this conversation about Baker Mayfield, Matt Rule, the play calling from Ben McAdoo. What is wrong with the Panthers? I feel pretty strong that a lot of this falls back on Rule, because I think a lot of it falls back on the scheme, everything that they implemented from July and August, and just everything organizationally. And part of that, I go back to the fact that last year things were actually a little bit better. When they had Joe Brady, I was excited early last year about DJ Moore's usage. They were coming up with creative answers when things weren't working. They started to put DJ Moore in the backfield a little bit and did some things to get him creative touches and get him into space on similar types of plays to what we just described from McCaffrey. Make sure you get the ball into your best players' hands. Call plays, or what is it? Think players, not plays, is the term that we talked about a lot last year that I loved. I don't remember where I heard it, but I fell in love with it. It's probably an old football adage. I'm not the biggest football guy in the world, but think players, not plays. I contrasted this in Stealing Signals this week with the Cowboys, who I thought did a really good job of thinking player, thinking CeeDee Lamb on Monday Night Football, throwing wide receiver screens to him, throwing a fade to him in the red zone, which is not a high percentage play, but you have CeeDee Lamb. He goes, he makes a one-handed catch, scores a touchdown, getting him into free space, running across the field deep where he drops the pass, but they still keep going back to him, and it works. And they even, I think, did it a little bit with Tony Pollard. They gave him the first rush attempt of the game. he has like a 14-yard gain. He later has a 46-yard gain. They're saying these are our playmakers, and we have to think player, not play. How do we get this guy the ball and let him impact the game? Because we have Cooper Rush at quarterback, and they go out and they win a football game with a bad team, basically. I mean, their offensive line played a little bit better with Jason Peters and some of those things, but you don't have a good team. You don't have a lot of depth of talent. You don't have, your second receivers, Noah Brown, Dalton Schultz isn't in there. Cooper Rush is your quarterback. They got a good defense, but they go ahead and win a divisional road game because they scheme their offense to think play or not play. The Panthers are like the exact opposite. They're just thinking it's 1st and 10. What do we do? Like they don't even realize they have Christian McCaffrey. They're just like, we're going to run the ball. Like that's what you do. They're treating Christian McCaffrey like I commented that they're giving him sort of the Joe Mixon treatment. We talk about how Mixon's workload is really huge, but the high value touch is not necessarily there. So much of what he gets is just the runs as part of the offense to get to the passes, right? And we actually saw in week 3 from the Bengals back against the wall 0-2 team, they didn't really use Mixon. They deprioritized him. I was really excited to see that they seem to understand where their bread is buttered. We need to throw the ball to win. They also protected Burrow a lot better. There's a lot of things that go into that. But, Derrick Henry workload, if you will, and Henry's a little different. It actually works for the Titans sometimes. But that's what McCaffrey got is the Derrick Henry workload this week, where it's a couple of catches, but it's mostly just early down runs. And you commented to me before the show, you have a 205-pound back or something. He's not Derrick Henry. He's not a 240-pound back. And yet he's still good enough that he's been efficient in despite this, which is maddening to me. But the high value
works against him that he's actually such a good pure runner as well.
It really does. And that's like almost frustrating, but it really does because if it wasn't working, maybe they would think of other ways to get him the ball. The Titans actually did that this week with Henry. Found creative ways to get him the ball in the passing game because he hasn't been running efficiently. Did a couple of the little play actions where he goes and sits behind the line of scrimmage and he's like the first read, throw right over the line of scrimmage. He's not the check down. It's a play action to him, but then they throw to him right behind the line of scrimmage, get him a catch behind the line of scrimmage, and then let him run a little bit. He had like 5 catches, barely ran any more routes or anything. That's what you see from these teams sometimes when their running back isn't running effectively. I think you're absolutely right. It works against it. But on the high value touches, before I kick this back to you, since I've gone on one of my rants, Christian McCaffrey last year, under Matt Rule, but with Joe Brady there as well, started the season with games of 11 and 10 high value touches. He gets hurt in week 3, comes back in week 4, limited snap share, then had another 11 high value touches in week 10. He came back in week 9 with that limited snap share. 11 high value touches in week 10, 7 more in week 11, gets hurt in week 12, done for the year. He played 4 games over 50% snaps last year. Double-digit high value touches 3 times, 7 in the other game. He has 12 through 3 weeks. High value touches, receptions, and touches in the red zone. And for the most part with McCaffrey, it's just receptions. So there are more receptions than touches in the green zone inside the 10. When I'm talking high value touches, I'm mostly talking receptions. McCaffrey is the clearest 10 high value touch guy a game ever. I mean, since Marshall Faulk. And he's been that. In his prime, he was averaging 7 receptions a game in 2018 and 2019. Even last year, even under Matt Rule, but again, when Joe Brady was there, and I was commenting to you before the show, I feel like early in the year last year when things weren't working, they had some answers. They tried some different things. They had things in their scheme that Brady went to, which I felt like the Cowboys did this week. They did some things, obviously, to get Lamb into some space. Whatever they were doing, I don't know all the X's and O's. It was getting Lamb into space or getting the ball into their players' hands. The Panthers right now look like an offense that's just a high school offense. I mean, we saw the Dan Orlovsky clip a week ago where they're lining up Christian McCaffrey behind Baker Mayfield in the shotgun and telling run, and even with him and telling pass. And they're showing what their alignment, their player alignment, for anyone who hasn't seen that video, pre-snap alignment of where the running back is, whether he's level with the quarterback or a yard behind him, is at least through week 2 was dictating their running pass decisions, basically. I mean, the plays were following suit based on that alignment, and Orlovsky broke that down on ESPN, and I thought it was a really interesting clip. This is stuff that happens at high school, at the high school level. Obviously, NFL defenses are able to figure it out. I think there's a lot of issues with just the way that the way that it starts with Matt Rule, but it's Ben McAdoo, it's whatever. I also think Baker's playing terrible, but I think he's sort of the perfect quarterback to look really bad in a really bad scheme. If there's no answers and there's no creative play calling and there's nothing there, he needs something to be there for him, frankly. And then even still, he probably misses it sometimes, holds the ball too long. He had that issue in Cleveland. But I just don't get the Christian McCaffrey thing. I mean, even setting aside DJ Moore, even last year under Matt Rule, this rate of high value touches, 10 plus per game, getting him the ball on these receptions. He has 12 through 3 games. I'm with you. I don't see how it turns around. And it's just so frustrating.
It is. I think that it's going to get better for DJ Moore. It's going to get better for Christian McCaffrey, but there really is nothing in place right now that would suggest that they can hit their draft cost, that they can come up with that type of scoring, not just when you already consider the damage that someone like DJ Moore has done, but if you look purely going forward, it's going to be very difficult for them to score in a range that would justify where they were picked. We talked about the Browns on our late week show last week, and the way that Jacoby Brissett is playing, it gives you this real sense of contrast. And yes, Baker Mayfield was dealing with injuries last season, but the play calling, the scheme, all of the things that you can do to help a quarterback out, we're seeing those things manifest in Cleveland with Brissett and Stefanski as the guy there doing a fantastic job. Mayfield now having to deal with really the opposite end of the spectrum, and we're seeing the result of that. It's very, very difficult. When we look at these scoring levels that we're getting from teams, both overall and on a per drive basis, one of the things that would appear to be obvious is that teams like the Bills and the Chiefs are being forced to go on these very long scoring drives. The defenses don't want them to be beaten over the top. But one of the interesting things that has also occurred to this point in 2022 is that even though some defenses are going to be allowing the offense to run, asking them to run, saying, look, we're okay with you guys doing a lot of low value plays, putting yourself in third downs, even if they're third and manageable. The fact that there are third downs and a lot of third downs put you in all of these different situations where you could be stuffed, you could make a mistake. It only takes one of those to force a punt or one of these interesting fourth down decisions. We've also had a number of field goal kickers like the Chiefs, for instance, and that they were not the only one by any stretch to lose the game because of missed field goals this last week. But then when I pull up the running back leaderboard, and we're always very cognizant of how running backs are scoring, which running backs who are drafted early are functioning as the anchor running back, which late round guys are emerging and could be the league winners because they perfectly complement more wide receiver heavy teams. When you pull up the running back leaderboard right now, it's just so crazy because the top 12 players in expected points, 9 of them are in the negative in terms of fantasy point over expectation. Let me say 10 of these guys are in the negative. The top 12, so the RB1 tier by workload, 10 of the 12 are underperforming that. And again, in many cases, the guys who are getting the biggest workload, they're getting that workload because they are the biggest talents in the NFL. And so when you're seeing guys like a Javonte Williams, like a Jonathan Taylor, like a Christian McCaffrey, like an Austin Eckler, like a Derrick Henry under, some of those things are going to turn around, and some of the situations you're really frustrated by what's happening with the offenses. It's not as surprising to see Joe Mixon leading the way in expected points at over 22, but underperforming that by 9 points per game. Again, some of this is going to be a little bit fluky on whether or not you score some touchdowns when you have that opportunity. But Javonte Williams, negative 5.5, that one I think we'll see turn. But Leonard Fournette at minus 3.7, especially within the context of this Tampa Bay offense, maybe that's an interesting one to go to here, Ben. The Bucs, despite the presence of Tom Brady, are actually they're at 1.27 points per drive here. They're at a 59-41 pass run ratio, in part because they've been trailing. But I mean, we saw them much pass heavier last year, in part because they had more weapons. I mean, this one's going to obviously turn around, but there are some pretty big concerns in Tampa.
Also, in week 3, which is where I thought you were going to go with that, they were at a positive 4.1 percentage points in pass rate over expected, and their expected pass rate was very high in week 3 at 72% because they were trailing, and they called pass plays on 76% of their plays in week 3. That was at least a little bit of a positive. I think I made the case recently that that's better for Fournette. He caught a couple more passes here. I actually think he's probably going to have one of those 8-catch games pretty quick if they start to throw the ball at that rate. And that's going to be pretty, good for him because that's the way that he gets his points in PPR, because he's not a very efficient player, but to be able to rack up a bunch of catches would be useful for him. It's interesting that he hasn't yet with all the receiver issues. But yeah, I mean, I guess I think with them, it's mostly got to be receiver related. It's also offensive line related, but you have to think that to some degree, the lack of health across the offense has impacted why they've been so run heavy. It was particularly in weeks 1 and 2. And as Godwin and obviously Evans will be back this week, but Julio, as all of them heal up here in the next 3 or 4 weeks, by mid-season, we should see them throwing at a decent clip again. And the way that Fournette's playing a lot, I mean, in this running back landscape, he actually could become sort of interesting, I think. But just from a purely receptions-based play, basically, because there's not to the point you were making about how inefficient all these players are. A guy like Javonte, that's really interesting. I pulled up his numbers. He's averaging 4.8 yards per carry. He's been running the ball effectively. Very poor in the passing game so far. Only 77 yards on his 15 catches. That's 5.1 yards per reception. Not good. Catch rate's really low too. 3.7 yards per target. The average for running backs about 6. He was at 6 his rookie year. He's well below average in terms of turning, targets into yards right now.
And we would expect that to change. I mean, the receiving EP numbers are at 11.8, which, I mean, that gives him a chance to be one of these legendary runners, but he's underperforming it by more than 4. He also has an issue on the running side in terms of how much they're using Melvin Gordon in the running game, and especially then in some of the high value areas.
The high value areas for sure. The green zone touches have leaned towards Gordon. I mean, that's a shocking one. And I'm really interested in your thoughts on a lot of these offenses, because I think I'm just going to sit here and harp on the coaches a lot. But I think I have a tendency to lean toward the coaching. And you maybe have some more insights on the players sometimes that are interesting, at least to me. My issue with the Broncos, you look at Melvin Gordon, he got both of the green zone touches late in that game on the same drive where he fumbled for the second time in the game, and the game's on the line. Like, he only has something like 40 touches on the year. He's fumbled 3 times now. He had already fumbled at the goal line in the Seattle game. I understand Javonte did as well. Javonte's was a weird one where he ran into his own lineman. Gordon's was fighting for extra yards and not protecting the ball. He had fumbled earlier in the game, earlier in the second half even, on Sunday night, and then on that fourth quarter drive fumbled. They got it back, and then at the end of the drive, they still use him in the green zone, which I think is a pretty bad sign for Javonte. As much as I am a big Javonte fan, that you're so certain that Melvin Gordon is your goal line back that even when he's fumbled twice in the second half and on that drive and nearly cost you that opportunity to score, you still use him on back-to-back carries in the green zone. He ends up punching in the go-ahead touchdown. So hats off to him for that, I guess. But Gordon did not run particularly effectively in this game. I've been very respectful of his skills and said many times that he was very good last year. He's now sub 4 yards per carry on the year in the same offense that Javonte Williams has been at 4.8. Gordon's at 3.9. Yards per carry is not everything, and Gordon is running on a lot of these sort of, compact plays. He's had a lot of the goal line touches and things like that. So that's going to impact his yards per carry negatively some. But, I mean, he's been fine. He's been better in the passing game as well. I just think it's really interesting to see him get the goal line carries there after those fumbles. But you're right. He's been getting a lot more of that in close work. That's not great for Javonte. Who are the positive efficiency players in the top 12? Barkley and Swift? Is that it?
Barkley and Nick Chubb. And
Chubb. Yeah, of course.
Those guys, not huge surprises. Barkley, the player that we kind of put out there is, maybe he'll be this year's Jonathan Taylor. Now, Barkley and Taylor were the two guys we were on in that price range last year. One a huge hit, one a huge miss. Kind of went back to the well on Barkley as he seemed healthier and as he was going to get this better coaching situation. So you mentioned harping on the coaches, but the coaches make such a huge difference. The Giants are only at 1.6 points per drive, but They have no NFL wide receivers out there on the field, and yet Daniel Jones still out there competing. He's scrambling some. The most frustrating thing in this game was that on a lot of these pass plays, Barkley was actually pass protecting, which you don't necessarily like to see. But despite that, he's averaging 10.1 receiving expected points per game. He's at 6.1 yards per carry. Almost all of that is after contact. He's at 1.2 before. Now, we talk a lot about how the before is also a running back skill, but there are so many things contextually about the Giants offense that are terrible for Barkley scoring. And yet, because of some of the elements of the play calling and scheme, and because of his talent level when he's healthy, he's been able to overcome those. And so while there are going to be some regression elements, I mean, so much of what he's done so far is the long touchdown run or the long run. Well, the touchdown run this last week, but the long run in the first week of the season. But even though those things are not going to happen every week, the actual context for him could get better, and it could get considerably better. And I think that when you have that talent married with a coach that you're enthusiastic about, then I just think you have to be really excited there, especially because you're not getting other players who have this combination of talent and workload that you can really see working out. I mean, one of the things with Jonathan Taylor is that there have been some minor positives from his perspective. He's actually not trailing Christian McCaffrey from a receiving EP perspective by very much. I mean, that was the big concern going into the season, is that gap makes it so that, I mean, he's got to hit at a ceiling level and CMC has to hit at a floor level for them to even really come into the same range. Now it looks like Taylor could actually just destroy him overall, but Taylor dealing with the Indianapolis Colts offense. And that's another situation where I think you're not going to have the coaching limitations that you're getting in some of these other places.
Yeah.
And yet Matt Ryan and the overall talent of the team is limited enough that, I mean, you're probably now for Jonathan Taylor hoping for a little bit more of sort of a median outcome as opposed to a ceiling outcome, just because the context there isn't great either.
That's a pure talent one. I'm right there with you. I mean, I think Frank Reich's a good coach. Matt Ryan is dust. I mean, you tried to warn me on that a little bit in the offseason, but he does not have the arm strength. He had the lowest average depth of target of any passer in week 3, really struggling to get the ball down the field. I mean, we talked about that a lot with Ben Roethlisberger. I think more with Roethlisberger last year, but people brought it up with Ryan in the Falcons. I didn't feel like I saw it as much with Ryan last year for whatever reason. I know you did. And I think we're right pretty clearly at this point, because Matt Ryan does not have the arm strength to attack defenses down the field, which is a problem. That became a huge problem for the entire Steelers offense last year, when the safeties don't have to respect your ability to throw it down the field because you just can't do it anymore. I mean, that's a problem. Michael Pittman, you have in the notes here, averaging 11 targets per game, 96 yards, but only at a 6.78 off. That's not his game. I mean, he's a big physical downfield receiver. He's been very good, and Ryan has really locked in on him. He's seeing a ton of volume. I wrote signals this week. I would give an arm and a leg to get DJ Moore to be, again, this think players, not plays, to be the focal point of his passing game in the way that the Colts clearly realize that Michael Pittman's their best receiver and think about getting him the ball. And yet, I think Pittman's probably ran hot so far in terms of what he's going to be able to do if his ADOT is that low, because his quarterback is not very good. He's been very efficient catching a lot of those lower volume targets. He's going to be good, but I'm not really worried about, some of the takes I had early after week 1 on Pittman not being a top 10 receiver. It's going to be really tough, even more so now that it's pretty clear that Matt Ryan can't throw. And that's a problem for Taylor as well, like you said.
And the racer for someone like Pittman right now is through the roof, which especially at the low ADOT, you're going to get some of that because the accuracy for Ryan is still there. The catch rate for Pittman over 77%. He's going to have the elite target share. But I think what you said after our week 1 show, where the similarities here between Pittman and CeeDee Lamb, probably the case in terms of dealing with some of the same issues, but the Cowboys have been much better at rectifying some of those. Now, Lamb has not played as well. And we saw that drop there where it was good that he was able, it was a huge positive note for him to rally off of that mistake, because I mean, we see drop passes, you see drop touchdowns all the time where people are kind of looking to make that move, even right at the end zone where they're basically already in the end zone. But you do not see a player like CeeDee Lamb drop one completely uncovered where the pass required absolutely nothing to bring it in. His expression after that play was someone who seemed like they were frustrated, but also relieved that they had benched them on their own fantasy team. But he rallied off of that and played very well.
Made some good plays.
Touchdown catch was amazing.
Touchdown catch was amazing. Went to the ground on a play to make a really nice catch. The contrast I drew between the Cowboys and Panthers in stealing signals was this commentary that, again, like just this idea that scheme matters. Why are we even talking about this? I don't think CeeDee Lamb, to your point that he hasn't played particularly well, and I've started to hear people kind of attacking DJ Moore a little bit. I don't think he's materially better than DJ Moore. I don't think we have any reason to believe that. I think Moore has limitations too, but you're literally just looking at two offenses where one is understanding how to get the ball to its players' hands, like you were just talking about, and the other's not. And I don't know. I'm kind of curious. Do you think that's too bullish on DJ Moore as a player? Do you think he's materially worse than CeeDee Lamb?
No, I mean, one of the things with Lamb is this idea that he could potentially take a step forward and show us some things that he hasn't, both from a demanding targets perspective, which deals with the whole cluster of talents and skills as you're doing the route running. Also from a catch point perspective, where he's been just awful this year. And so you get that touchdown catch and you think, I mean, a little bit of some of these things you can just get in your head. I mean, these are people, right? Not machines. And so you had that stretch where basically over the last 3 years, no one has gotten open like Deontay Johnson. Now, some of that is that he's asked to get open in the short area. Some of the players who are probably similar are being asked to get open a little bit deeper, which is going to be a different kind of challenge in terms of even when the quarterback can just pull the trigger on those passes to you. But he went through that stretch where he couldn't catch anything and, even benched for a short stretch because of that. He hasn't rallied back to be some great receiver of the football from that perspective, but we did see him make the highlight catch earlier this season where it was an Odell Beckham type of play even. You get out of that rut a little bit. And that's one of the things with Lamb, to see him come back and make that touchdown catch, it's just so huge because then, and especially as it really led to them winning the game. Right. He's not going to be in a situation where he has to spend the whole week thinking about that drop. Now that drop is going to show up on some low light things. It's going to be talked about on lots of shows like we're doing. But for him, it doesn't matter because he made the plays to win the game. And so you go forward off of that. I mean, you mentioned again, the quarterback play and the scheme. One of the things that we see consistently is that when you say players, not plays, but in so many ways, it just has to be both. And you think about how do you get the player involved? Well, it stems from a good scheme and an ability to call plays. One of the things when the Rams struggle, they can come back and execute in different ways the next week, do some different things. And we've watched them trying to get Allen Robinson involved. He may just be at a level where you can't even do that. But they're going to be able to get their guys to work.
They're thinking players, but they're thinking the wrong players.
When the Chiefs have a game like they just had and Andy Reid puts it on himself, it's easier to put it on yourself when you're good at things, right? It's people who are bad at things who have to deflect the blame. Andy Reid has all of the track record to say, I blew this game in a variety of ways. I'm going to come back and coach better next week, try and actually take the blame off of his players. At the same time, saying the guys who made mistakes that cost us this game also took personal accountability for that within the team context, right? So that's a team where, the Chiefs were awful last week. And they looked like a team that, number one, is frustrated with actually where they are right now, but also was too sort of full of themselves. So they're like, we're not where we want to be, but we also thought that was going to still be easily enough to beat the Indianapolis Colts.
But they should have won that game. You had the Sky Moore fumble early. You had a missed field goal and a missed extra point. You had Kelsey dropping a pass in the end zone that was very catchable, maybe not a perfectly on target throw that was immediately preceded the missed field goal. Then they went for it they tried a fake field goal at one point because that was before the missed field goal, but that was after the missed extra point because they didn't have faith in their backup kicker or their kicker that they signed off the street, Matt Amendola, and they get no points out of field goal range twice in the fourth quarter. The Colts have the short field touchdown early off the fumble. They get a couple of field goals throughout the game. They don't do anything else the whole game. And then they win on a go-ahead touchdown on the last drive. That's a really long, slow drive. Their best drive of the day by far. The only time they ever got anything really going offensively to that degree. And even that was because of a really weird unsportsmanlike conduct penalty that was no physical action. It was something that I think it was Chris Jones must have said to Matt Ryan. They were kind of face to face, and as he's walking off, the official throws the flag. They showed a slow-mo replay of it. Even the announcers are going, it must have been what he said because he didn't do anything.
Well, those guys were talking to each other for a while too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they let it go. And then finally he says something and they throw the flag, and Chris Jones kind of looks over and like, we're just trash talking here. It's like, I thought we were allowed to say nasty things to the opponent.
As he's walking off too. I mean, what's the point of throwing that flag? Really? And it cost the Chiefs the game, honestly. And that was because that was a 4th down. They had just failed to convert. I believe it was a 3rd and 15. They were going to have to punt on like a 4th and 15, and instead they get an automatic first down. But yeah, I agree with you. The Chiefs look poor. I'm curious.
This was like the Bills-Jaguars game from last season.
Yeah.
But at least in this game, I mean, you can look at it from the good perspective or the bad perspective. That Bills-Jaguars game was hard to figure out, like, even what happened. In this Chiefs game, they had to do like 7 absurd things to lose the game. And those things are pretty correctable. But from an overall perspective of, like, how do we compete with a team like the Buffalo Bills when they have a long way to go? But Andy Reid is saying, we're going to make those changes. And you have confidence in him because you've seen him do it so many times. And if he says, I'm going to get Travis Kelce more involved, we're going to get Sky more involved, some of that is on us. There were plays in this game that we had drawn up for him on 3rd down, and the way the defense covered it, the target wasn't there. We should have had him more involved on 1st and 2nd down. You're watching that game as a fantasy manager, and you're thinking, get him off the field to return the punts. That's not where we want to have him involved. But you have a coach saying things that, number one, you want to hear, but then number two, because of the track record, I mean, you have full confidence that those things are actually true.
Yeah.
And for so many of these teams that are on the have-not side, we don't necessarily know that those things are going to happen. Now, in terms of some positives, you look at the Denver Broncos and Cortland Sutton, 354 air yards. There are only 3 guys with more than he has. His racer is much better than those 3. I mean, the thesis on Sutton seems to be playing out even in an otherwise apocalyptic landscape for the Broncos. I think you've got to be excited about him. I think you've got to be excited about Williams. Yeah, I was very much on this side of, I think Russell Wilson's weaknesses are going to be a problem as he ages, and yet I think he's going to bounce back in 2022 and be much better than he's been. And
well, he has to. He's been terrible. I mean, he's been. Oh, you can finish. That's all I had.
So you can still see where this offense can go. Yeah. And I mean, Jerry Jeudy's lack of physicality has been pretty obnoxious to people who have him on their team. So he was open deep for what could have been a long touchdown. I mean, he needs to make a little bit better effort when he sees the defender start to make a play on the ball. But if that ball is thrown even another 6 inches, I mean, he walks in for a touchdown. So there are plays for the Broncos that are going to work. You can be excited there. The 49ers look absolutely terrible, but you can be excited there. I mean, Samuel and Ayuk have combined for a 50% target share. This is a team that's going to snap back to a more normal NFL offense. They're currently at a 47% pass rate, which, I mean, you can't do now that you have Jimmy Garoppolo in as the starter.
And that changed this week. They were really negative in the monsoon game, but even in week 2, when Lance got hurt and Garoppolo took over, they were much more neutral in week 3 in terms of their pass rate over expected. I think they were a slight positive. Yeah, 2.5 percentage points to the positive in week 3 relative to game script. So they were willing to throw a little bit more in week 3. Their numbers are still skewed, I think, from weeks 1 and 2. But a couple notes on all of a couple of those teams. One, Kittle ran routes on over 80% of dropbacks in week 1. I was concerned about him pass blocking a lot because of Lance, basically, throughout the draft season. I thought that was a really exciting note for Kittle. Didn't see a lot of targets, but he's probably a guy to be trying to buy a little bit right now. I do think the Samuel and Ayuk point is very well taken. Ayuk looks very involved as the downfield guy. And Samuel, encouraging note on him with Garoppolo, 8 out of 2 and then negative 0.5 or something in his first 2 weeks. Very low ADOTs. It went up to 7 this week. It's always going to be somewhat low. The average for a receiver is like 11. But at 7, it's an average depth. He's getting those plays on the line of scrimmage that are going to bring down that average. But at 7, it's an indication he got some downfield targets in this game. You see that and you immediately think,
well, he was missed badly on the play too that would have allowed them to win the game as opposed to lose the game late, where he was coming open and Garoppolo missed. Garoppolo, coming off of the offseason surgery, has not been the guy that they wanted to be the QB. Not a superstar, but he's going to look better, right? And I mean, you get the Dan Orlovsky kind of play there.
That was so bad. I mean, he was lucky to go out of bounds because he threw a pick six otherwise.
It was almost like in the back of his head, he's thinking to himself before he releases that ball. He's like, I've already made several mistakes on this play. And then you lose your concentration on the pass. He's thinking as he releases it, like, am I in bounds? No. Well, now I hope I'm not in bounds. But all three of these guys are massive buys, wouldn't you say?
I think so. Yeah. Ayuk, Samuel, and Kittle. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think Samuel with the ADOT thing looks a lot more like last season, and that's a fantastic. I think Ayuk's a buy too. Yeah, I'm with you. I think they all are buys. This offense is going to rebound. The point you made on Judy, I thought, was sort of a subtle one on that deep ball, but a good point. And I wrote about Chris Olave. For anyone who wants to see what Sean's talking about, I think Chris Olave did it really well on his deep catch this week in week 3. So go back and check that out, where he was a little bit underthrown, but kind of came back into the contact to make sure he secured the ball before the contact instead of sort of letting the ball and the defender get to him at the same time. It was a really nice play. I was actually really impressed by Olave on that play. He's getting all these chucked up passes. I don't know what's going to come of that. Jameis Winston right now, highest 8 out of any passer in the NFL, and yet he's thrown 3 picks in the last 2 weeks targeting Olave. So, and they've been bad as an offense. So, how much more of this just, we're going to throw it up and pray stuff are they going to do this week? Both Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry leave the game early. They even threw up a bunch to Traquan Smith, who didn't play a ton, but winds up with a 100-yard game with well over 100 air yards. They're just chucking it and praying. They seem lost. What are your thoughts on the Saints?
Well, it's prototypical Jameis Winston, right? I mean, this is what you get from him. If you're going to be conservative like they were last year, he can't move the ball. If you're going to let him throw it, then there are going to be a ton of turnovers. I think it's pretty fun. I mean, Olave has been fantastic. He looks like a guy. We joked sort of during the offseason about how being NFL ready, is that code for, a low ceiling. He looks great. I mean, you watch Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, and you're thinking to yourself, when the Lions have Jameson Williams, that team is going to be unbelievable. Now, that my Jared Goff enthusiasm has been offset from a reality perspective by the fact that, he's constantly throwing terrible passes. He's surrounded by such a fun offense. DeAndre Swift and Khalil Herbert, the two guys in the NFL who are averaging more than 3 yards both before and after contact. I've kind of taken this in a weird direction, sort of inadvertently, thinking about Wilson and Olave. But the Lions in this game, as soon as Swift goes out, but then when Amon-Ra turns his ankle, they go from being unstoppable to having real trouble because Amon-Ra I'm stunned by how explosive he is. I just don't understand what USC was doing. He's the guy who could have had you think about the season that Devontae Smith had in college. And we saw a lot of that in week 3 as he just lights the world on fire. It was really cool. That was my favorite development of week 3. That's probably not a surprise to listeners. But even just the difference, but pre and post minor ankle injury, you could tell how much more difficulty he was having out of his cuts to get open. And it was almost, again, this Christian McCaffrey type thing where when he cuts, when he's healthy, he immediately leaves the defender. And Jared Goff's like, okay, well, this is like throwing to a college game where you don't have to make a good throw because the guy is so wide open. As soon as the guys get covered a little bit more, then Goff starts missing people wildly. But I do think that, and DJ Chark's has been a little bit of a disappointment. Josh Reynolds playing a lot and playing pretty well. I'm so excited for the teams where we have Williams stashed. We don't know that it's going to happen this year, but that team, anyway, my Lions are going to be fun. Going back to Olave and...
I just love your Jared Goff point that your enthusiasm for him is offset a little bit by the fact that he's terrible. Offset a little bit. No, I agree with you totally on the line. I didn't catch the Swift injury, the shoulder injury, while watching all the games, and I was pretty confused about the heavy Jamal Williams usage late. He got stuffed on the 4th down, then they ended up kicking a field goal because they can't convert. I had a note until I saw the injury a little bit later. I had a note in my Stealing Signals notes. It was like, you just can't be using Jamal Williams on a 4th and 1. You're going to lose the game because of it. Basically, come to realize, obviously, they didn't have an alternative. But Williams, is what he is. But that was a pretty big
Justin
blow.
Jackson season.
It feels like it has to be, right?
I didn't catch that during the game either. The thing that was, even before you it's almost this like tiny silver lining. Now, when you have a shoulder injury and you had like the Dalvin Cook situation where, he's having a great game, but then you lose that. And we talk all the time about, you need the huge games if you want your team to win its league. And if you're especially in leagues where points matter, you need those huge games so you end up in the points lead. And that's what we're going for. We're not going to finish 3rd or 4th or 6th or whatever. You're trying to win the whole thing. You need the huge games. And Dalvin Cook can't give you that if he's losing those late game points to an Alexander Madison. The silver lining for Swift might be that now he misses a month and he comes back healthy, because one of the other things that happened in the game, I thought it was purely the ankle, because he has an explosive carry early in the game and gets up, and you can tell that his ankle is jacked up. That they were saying he felt better this week. It's really probably mostly a miracle that he was able to score fantasy points in week 2, because not healthy, right? He's got 2 fairly serious injuries at this point. He needs to take a month off. Maybe he comes back healthy. And then if you've built the right kinds of teams, if you have these teams, with Garrett Wilson and Drake London, Devontae Smith, Romeo Doubs, then you can get through, and maybe you have a DeAndre Swift team in the second half of the year that very few other good teams have. And so, that's how you have to look at it when you lose someone the caliber of DeAndre Swift, because you're not going to be able to plug somebody else in who's similar. He's on a level that's, mostly by himself.
And there's so few running backs succeeding, as we've talked about throughout this pod already. I got to get your take on Devonta Smith, because you mentioned to me at some point somewhere in an email or something that we saw different stuff from the Eagles this week. My takeaway was, it's so nice for Devonta Smith to have A.J. Brown on the team to open up the stuff that he's clearly opened up, and that A.J. Brown is still very clearly the alpha. And we saw it, 4th down late, they're going to ice the game. They go to A.J. Brown. They've gone to A.J. Brown on his key spots. The announcers mentioned during the game, I think coming into week 3, he was leading the NFL in 3rd down catches and 3rd down yards. When they need a big play, they're going to A.J. Brown. Very nice for Devonta Smith as sort of that secondary player to A.J. Brown to have a big game. What was the difference that you saw for the Eagles? I want to know how you internalized what we witnessed.
Well, the difference here was, like I was saying when we drafted our Chasing Stolen Bananas team, that we're figuring out who the 1A and who the 1B is, right?
Yeah. So you're saying the difference was that Devonta Smith in week 3 was the 1A now. He showed that he's better than A.J. Brown. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't think that anybody is better than A.J. Brown. You get 205 air yards for Smith, 130 for Brown. Jalen Hurts looks just extraordinary. The one a little bit annoying thing in this game was just that the Commanders didn't do their part to create the shootout, right? Because this could have been like the Dolphins game in week 2, where you have a 40-point game from both Waddle and Hill. This is set up for this if Carson Wentz were an NFL quarterback, but they've got to get Sam Howell out there. I have no idea what they think they're accomplishing. Obviously Wentz did some fun things in the first 2 weeks. He was going to obviously be the starter in week 3. He's going to obviously be the starter in week 4. But I think you have to have your Sam Howell watch going now, because you saw the problems. This is 2 weeks in a row where the Commanders essentially can't get a first down in the first half, and you get blown out. If Washington, a team that has Jahan Dotson, is using Curtis Samuel, who has Terry McLaurin, who has receiving backs, for them to not compete in this game and to not really sort of foment the shootout was frustrating, because this Eagles team is so fun. You could have had 200-yard games from both players if they had needed to do it in the second half. The thing that you love to see here is that you look at the wide receiver breakdown, and it's not just that those guys combine for almost 350 air yards, but they have 22 of the 25 wide receiver targets. Now, Zach Pascal and Quez Watkins have been doing some fun things. We saw Watkins with the long touchdown in week 2, I believe. And I mean, they have these guys to be the complementary pieces, but to have a team, again, that knows where their bread is butter, knows where their superstars are. I think that both of these guys are absolutely fantastic. I wasn't sure that Smith would be able to do it with Brown there and in an offense that could still be run heavy. This has been the best story, I think, for us, at least through the first 3 weeks, because we've bet heavily on the Eagles.
It has to be the best story in football. I was just looking, as we were talking about how bad the offenses are at the total yards, and you have the Eagles leading the NFL right ahead of the Bills. They're both just over 1,300 total yards. You have the Lions at 1,227, and then the fourth place team is the Ravens. They're all the way down at 1,141 total yards. That's still a lot, but it's 200 yards fewer exactly than the Eagles in first place. So there's this huge gap between the couple offenses that have actually been good. It's amazing to see the Lions in the top 3, but the Eagles leading the NFL in total yards in a year where there's only 3 teams so far that have averaged 400 total yards per game through these first 3 weeks. That's a lot, but usually we'll have more than 3 doing that through a couple of games. There's only 9 that have 1,100 yards so far. There's a lot of teams that are not producing, as we've been talking about all show. Eagles have to be they're the story of the season so far offensively.
And I mean, obviously we have some Mark Andrews, we don't have enough, but the main point that we were pushing, that you need to be in on the best players and the best offenses, even if you have a rushing quarterback, has played out in a huge way. The Ravens obviously lighting the world on fire from a points perspective. Lamar Jackson, I mean, the best way to play that would be obviously to have Mark Andrews. The second best would be to have Lamar Jackson, but the other pieces there, because of the scoring context, I think are going to pay off. But Mark Andrews, very clearly someone who is not being killed by Lamar Jackson scoring so many points. I mean, his level of scoring and his level of volume is unsustainable, but it's going to be fantastic because they're going to score a lot of points. The 49ers is going to work out because their rushing quarterback got hurt, which is a pathway that people don't like to think about. I mean, we don't like to think about it. It was devastating for us, but one that did work out. And now those guys are all undervalued. And the Eagles is going to work out because those guys are superstars and the team realizes that they're superstars, and it's going to be much more pass heavy than people were betting on.
Yeah, that's a huge storyline as you break it down that way. It's these run heavy quarterbacks that people were not necessarily as in on their passing games. That was wrong. It was wrong to be worried about projecting team volume. I mean, that's something we said with the Eagles all offseason, that they were one of the teams that could be sort of this year's Bills and be a lot more pass heavy than we were expecting. We have seen that. We nailed that. The Andrews thing, there's nothing that's more frustrating for me through a couple of weeks than my Andrews exposure. It was tied to the Kyle Pitts enthusiasm, but I talked in the offseason about how my DJ Moore enthusiasm last year led me to not have much of Cooper Kupp. I did have a couple Cooper Kupps. I had them in like the Scott Fish Bowl where I had this really great team, but they were going in such similar ranges and I was taking so much DJ Moore, and I didn't want my enthusiasm for a breakout player to overlap other players. And so something I said when we talked about Pitts so many times this offseason was I didn't want my enthusiasm for Pitts to lead me to have 0 Andrews. I know you remember this. I had that point many times. I ranked Pitts behind Andrews for most of the offseason until their ADPs converged, which was a way for me to remember, like, I can't in every draft say, oh, well, I'll just get Pitts later. I want to get some Andrews. And yet we ended up taking a lot of Pitts. I ended up taking a lot of Pitts. I have Andrews in a couple of high-stakes spots, but just as a result of being so excited about Pitts, it just happens. Even as I was talking constantly and actively thinking about it and ranking it that way, I wanted more Andrew. I wanted to make sure that I had exposure to both of those guys, and I do have some Andrews teams, but it's just one of those things in fantasy where I'm still very enthusiastic about Pitts. I don't think, because I got a lot of feedback on Twitter and elsewhere about with Pitts not scoring particularly high so far, about how that was wrong because of Andrews. And that gap is already so wide that it's tough to see.
But we are, and everything doesn't come down to air yards by any stretch, but we already are in a situation where Andrews is probably unsustainable, but he's gapped everybody. But Pitts is in second and has gapped Travis Kelce, despite the fact that the Falcons refuse to throw the ball. And so I guess I'm not even worried about it from that perspective, but Mark Andrews has been the most important player in fantasy. So anytime that you don't have a huge exposure, then, or just whatever your exposure is, you wish that you had more. We joked about it a couple of weeks ago with you, and then I'm going to have to keep joking with you about it all season. We had the listener contest to draft an FPC team with me, and the team that Eric and I drafted is a Saquon Barkley and Mark Andrews team, where AJ Brown fell to us in the 3rd round. So that team is the only undefeated team left in its conference. It's going well through 3 weeks. Eric and I had a lot of fun with it, and we're looking forward to the future with that one.
Yeah, that's a really fun team. That's, I guess, ultimately my frustration is not having enough exciting builds like that. That, you have a lot of player ticks. I can't do Underdog in my state. I've talked about it on the show before, I think, but I don't have a lot of, best ball teams and all, so many different rosters that I have some of those types of teams to look forward to. And I don't think I have the enough of those types of builds that I'm just like so thrilled about. But that's how it goes in fantasy. It's frustrating. Part of the reason I'm sharing it again is, as always, I think there's listeners that probably feel the same way, that are looking at taking Pitts. There's spots where I took Pitts over Andrews, but I did, like I said, take Andrews in a few spots as well, and over Pitts in some spots. So just one of those things, like you said, that when a guy is doing as well as Andrews is, you wish you had more, no matter how much you have. But I can't. It's that I had that thought all throughout the offseason that I couldn't let my Pitts excitement, because I got on to Andrews and I couldn't let it limit my Andrews, and it still did, because they're early round picks. You can't have one of those two on every single roster, right? They only fit into certain teams.
You got to have a little bit of DeAndre Swift there as well.
We had some Swift, we had some Barkley in those ranges, and even some Lamb and some of those guys who haven't paid off as much. You got to have a little bit of variability. So anyway, it is what it is.
And Rashad Bateman and J.K. Dobbins are coming.
That's what you keep telling me. Any other teams that we didn't cover? We didn't talk about the Jets. You have them here, number 1 in seconds per snap. They've run a ton of plays. They've thrown a ton of passes. I'm actually pretty concerned about several of the Jets players because of that atmosphere, and because with Zach Wilson taking over, I expect them to throw less. I think there's just basically every offense Joe Flacco's ever ran has had the potential for these types of 50 to 60 pass attempt games, because he's so statuesque and doesn't move, and he's not mobile. And then there's also just an element with him where, like, doesn't take a lot of sacks, he doesn't scramble, and when they get behind, he's just getting the ball out to his first read, and he just racks up pass attempts, a bunch of short passes, a lot of running back targets. We've seen Tyler Conklin get a bunch of targets out of the tight end position. I called him noise this week. I think he's still somebody that you can have, but in stealing signals, I said is 8 targets per game so far, probably pretty noisy. Looks like a pretty clear hot start, going to fizzle out kind of a guy, because that's also come in conjunction with, first of all, Garrett Wilson not playing full snaps yet, and he was set to this week, but he gets hurt and misses some time due to the rib injury, comes back and he's fine, but we never got that full snap share game out of Garrett Wilson here in week 3, still haven't gotten it. And then also Elijah Moore, who's run more routes than anybody in the NFL, is only earning a target on 14% of his routes. That's pretty concerning. I've gotten to the point with Elijah Moore where I don't know how long we just keep putting him in lineups and hoping that he hits, because there is this element where he only ran 300 routes last year. He looked good. I do still think everything's going to work out for Elijah Moore, but he's run a ton of routes and put up very little production so far. Where are you at with the whole Jets offense and their total volume so far with the QB switch looming?
Yeah, when you are far and away the number 1 team in the NFL in terms of seconds to snap, when you're up there at the very top in pass plays per game, then these things can go in the wrong direction very easily, especially if you bring in a quarterback who, you'd like to think that he brings a lot of those same elements that Flacco brings, and yet maybe a little bit more accuracy. And the most hilarious pass in this game was at the very end, where they're trying to score in garbage time. And if you have, any of these guys, we have Breece Hall, and he runs this very nice route that's very similar to, what we've been asking for from Christian McCaffrey, is wide open. And Joe Flacco threw a pass that would have been hard to catch if he had been 40 yards downfield, much less just, 8 or so. There are some possibilities for things to get better if Wilson can take the next step. But he was not a guy who was generating a ton of enthusiasm from people covering the team in training camp the way that Trevor Lawrence was for taking a step forward with the Jaguars. So I think you have to be concerned. There are some things that can sort of flip back in a very positive direction depending on who you have. Breece Hall and Michael Carter, despite being two of the most electric running backs in football, have combined for a total of 8.5 rushing expected points per game. I mean, they're going to be able to show what they can do a little bit, if there's any blocking for them there, if the defense has to respect the pass at all. Breece Hall, I think, has been maybe sort of low-key one of the most exciting players in football through 3 weeks, but it's been covered up by so much else that the Jets have been
doing. And they used him weirdly in week 2, and there's been some stuff. He has double-digit target games in weeks 1 and 3, right? But I'm with you on the rush EP stuff, and he looks so good that you're still in on Hall, but I do have concerns about just how much receiving work he's gotten. There's just almost no way. It's a question not of if that goes down, but how much. Because I think there's a certainty that when you talk about the plays, the seconds per snap, I mean, we talk about how like Aaron Rodgers always takes the clock way down. Russell Wilson's a guy who does that. It is pretty quarterback driven. And that also is a Flacco thing where they're trailing, and it's probably smart on his part, but he's getting the team set and he's snapping the ball. I mean, he's not waiting around to read the defense or anything. This wasn't a particularly fast offense last year with Zach Wilson under center. I wouldn't expect them to stay at first and snap with Zach Wilson.
Well, I mean, he's going to get out there, and it was really cool and interesting to watch him play these 3 games because you see the value of having a quarterback who can make the decisions quickly and pull the trigger, even if the accuracy isn't there. You mentioned the thing with Elijah Moore. I mean, this could go in almost any direction, right? He's got almost the exact same number of air yards as Stephon Diggs. His air share, 26%, so much higher than the target share. I mean, there was a chance. I mean, he could have had almost like a 30-point game in week 3. There were so many close calls where he is open deep, and Flacco airs it out to him, gives him a chance. One of them, he doesn't make a play he probably should make most of the time. A lot of the other passes aren't that accurate. And so you get one of these really empty vertical threat types of games. You look at that and contrast that with Chris Olave, for example, and the enthusiasm that you have with how they're using Olave. I mean, Jameis Winston is not going to be someone who's like wildly accurate on these downfield passes either. Olave has made some plays. That matters. The wide receiver portion of it matters. Elijah Moore has left points on the field, and yet the way that they've used him and his ability to get open has been a dramatic positive through the first 3 weeks. So I guess I'm not concerned about him, certainly long-term. He's one of the most, I was looking at some of my dynasty teams that are struggling through 3 weeks with the idea that I was going to go out and get Elijah Moore. And then I realized that one of the reasons those teams are struggling is that they have Elijah Moore. But he's a good buy low. Definitely in dynasty. I think that he's going to have an excellent season, or he's going to have a solid season the rest of the way. Much of it is going to depend on like just how dynamic Garrett Wilson is. I think the only way that Elijah Moore is not still a contributor is if Wilson has basically an Odell Beckham-like rookie season. If he does that, which seems positive, that was the other kind of most disappointing thing on Sunday, because Wilson was on pace for another big game. Mm-hmm. And that hit that knocked him out for a while with the ribs, that was a perfectly legal type of hit, but it was absolutely vicious. When I saw him get hit there, I was shocked that he came back in. I mean, that looked like something that you could be out for half the season. I mean, that was a brutal blow to the midsection that he took on that one. I guess I'm still like just vaguely optimistic because the Jets are going to trail, and you're going to try and cover up or protect your young quarterback to an extent. But the Jets are in this situation, and the Chicago Bears are in this situation, and yet their decision-making has been brutal and hard to fathom through 3 weeks. But the Jets have to know what Zach Wilson is going to be able to do for them at the end of this season. So you need to, and you're going to trail, you're going to have a lot of these scripts where, even a Carson Wentz can sometimes score some points. You're going to have weapons. This Jets team has to be fun. They have to be exciting. They have to go out there and attack. They have to find out what their quarterback can do, because if they need to make a move, they have to make it at the end of this year, because the Jets are going to be in that top 3 or 4 teams in all of football in terms of the quality of their weapons.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't go into 2023 and not know if Zach Wilson can play.
Yeah, and that's why they have to play him. My concern is just you look at the seconds per snap, that's coming down, or it's going up. You look at the pass volume, and you pointed it out with the rush EP. I mean, they're going to shift towards more runs. I think their offense is going to look a lot different, and people are really excited. I've seen some commentary that's really excited about their pass volume, about their fast pace, all of those things. I think a lot of that has to do with Flacco, and I do think that's going to change. There's still reason for optimism, but I guess I'm just trying to temper expectations a little bit relative to the total size of the pie in the volume that we've seen through 3 games.
Yeah, it's going to be smaller. I guess a little bit of the optimism there comes from, and I don't know that we know enough yet to definitively say, okay, Mike LaFleur as the offensive coordinator is going to be a positive, but he comes from this group of coaching or this coaching tree, what have you, this coaching culture where I think there's reason to be optimistic. Now you can see some coaches who will come out of that and, you know, they have a connection to offenses that are good, you know, family members who have been successful. It's not, I mean, people are not clones of other people. You have to be good in your own right. And we've also seen some of the coaches come out of these environments and look overwhelmed. And so, you know, we don't know that he is going to be a difference maker for the Jets, but I guess there's room for some optimism that the Jets are not going to get mired down in some of the problems that we're seeing with the Bears, some of the problems that we're seeing with the Panthers. And, you know, it's still, if your quarterback can't play, it's not going to matter. But having a lot of weapons helps, which Carson Wentz demonstrated through the first 2 weeks. So I guess from that perspective, I think there's still room for a lot of enthusiasm.
I think there's plenty of gray area between what we're saying. I don't think they're going to be the Bears or the Panthers either. But as far as like ancillary pieces and stuff, I mentioned Conklin. I saw some optimism about Conklin this week, and I just think that's, you know, like I said, I called that noise. And I do worry even with their best players. How much can Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore, Breece Hall coexist, especially as Michael Carter is still going to be involved? How can that all coexist? But like, you know, Corey Davis and Conklin and those guys, I think you already have to expect will be shuffled out a little bit with the lowering overall volume. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that they'll still play fast. I'm hopeful that they'll still throw a decent amount, that some of these things will carry over with Wilson under center. It doesn't have to be the Bears. You know, I'm with you on that.
Well, Ben, this has been so much fun. Week 3 again, some real heartache, some really exciting developments. We've got some teams that are looking absolutely fantastic. We've got some teams that have some work to do. I think a lot of people after 3 weeks, you know, a lot of people in some of those boats. My excitement level for what we're going to get going forward with this season is very high. We're going to see some of these running backs bounce back. We're going to see some of these offenses get better. We've had the breakouts really earlier than I was expecting for the young wide receivers. And that part now puts us in such a good position. It wasn't the theme of the show today, but obviously Romeo Doubs on Sunday, just such a cool storyline there. I can't wait for the next show. But until then, this has been Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch. Make sure you sign up for Stealing Signals. Make sure you sign up for Stealing Lines. We'd love to have you guys join us over at RotoViz. You can use the coupon code RVRadio2022 at checkout. Subscribe to the feed. You guys have been doing so awesome in terms of all of the ratings and reviews, all of the comments on the YouTube channel. All those things help us out. Every interaction that we get helps us with an algorithm here, there, or yon. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.